Made with Spoken. Broad is the Road, a Havoc in Wyoming short story. By Millie Copper. Digital narration performed by Conversational Carl. George crouched at the edge of Oak Creek, working by feel in the darkness. The first bottle slid into his backpack, water sloshing against plastic. Cold spray hit his fingers as he positioned the second bottle under the surface. He counted seconds while it filled, listening to the night sounds. Crickets. The whisper of water over stone. The distant yip of coyotes in the hills. 10 months into the apocalypse, these trips for water became routine. Dangerous, but routine. Leave the house after it was good and dark. Take different routes each time. Fill the bottles, do a little scavenging for anything remaining that they might be able to use. Get home before dawn. Don't get caught. Don't lead anyone back to Shirley. Above all else, that was the most important thing. Keep Shirley safe. The system worked, but only because he'd been doing it so long. Before everything fell apart, he rarely walked the area. Hardly ever did he explore the trails or head to the creek. He was too busy for that. 6 years spent in Arizona performing HVAC services for resorts and luxurious homes required his full attention not just during the workdays, but often on weekends as well, especially since he was the only full-time guy in the area. The company he'd worked for in Wyoming purchased a small mom-and-pop shop down in Arizona, intending to staff it with local people, but they wanted someone they could count on to lead the team. George eagerly accepted the opportunity when the company offered it. Besides, he and Shirley both discussed moving to Arizona for retirement. As much as they loved Wyoming, winters were getting hard on both of them, and the pay the company offered was almost double what he was getting back home in Prospect. Might as well take the opportunity. Voices shattered the night. George's hands froze on the bottle. Flashlight beams swept through the cottonwoods 50 yards downstream. I tell you, I saw someone walking this way. Probably a deer. Deer don't walk upright. George's fingers fumbled with the bottle cap, screwing it on with shaking hands. The bottle was only half full. Not enough, but staying here another second meant getting caught. He twisted the cap tight and shoved the bottle into his pack. The flashlight swung closer. George slung the pack over his shoulder and moved, staying low using the sparse brush for cover. His boots slipped on the wet stone. Branches snapped behind him. The flashlight swung in his direction. There, I saw movement. George ran. His breath came in harsh gasps. The backpack bounced, water sloshing inside. Behind him, boots pounded through the brush, men who were making enough noise to wake the dead. But they might have guns. George knew what armed groups did to lone scavengers. He'd seen the bodies. This wasn't the early days when people still believed in law and order. Now the only law was strength, and the only order was violence. He veered left, scrambling up a slope. Loose scree slid under his boots. He grabbed a juniper branch for balance and pulled himself up. His lungs burned, his legs screamed. At 54, his body couldn't handle this kind of running. Before the collapse, he was developing a gut, spending his days in air-conditioned comfort, driving between service calls and eating fast food in his truck. Months of close to starving trimmed him down. George was lean now, hard but also weaker. Malnutrition did that. No matter how carefully they rationed, they weren't getting enough calories, weren't getting enough of anything. A gunshot cracked through the canyon. The bullet ricocheted off sandstone somewhere to his right, the whine of metal on rock making him flinch mid-stride. He didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. If they caught him, they might torture him for information. Where did he live? What supplies did he have? Was he alone? And if he didn't lose them, they'd follow him home. To Shirley. George veered sharply to the right, heading for the former resort territory where the UFO enthusiasts set up their settlement. He'd watched them for months while gathering water, staying hidden in the shadows, observing. They'd formed a genuine community, organized, defended, working together. George steered clear of them because the Survivalist podcast said trust was suicide, because lone wolves survived when groups fell apart from infighting and betrayal. But right now, leading 3 armed men toward the hippie commune seemed like a better option than leading them to his wife. The terrain grew rougher, and George knew exactly what to do. His pursuers didn't. One of them cursed as he stumbled. Another barked orders as if this were a military operation. Perhaps former soldiers, or wannabes who'd finally found a sense of purpose in the apocalypse. His destination was a narrow gap in the red rocks he'd discovered years ago while hauling equipment to a remote cabin. The homeowner wanted climate control in the most inconvenient location possible, and George spent a miserable afternoon carrying ductwork up a trail barely wide enough for his boots. He'd found the gap, a split in the sandstone hidden behind Manzanita, wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. George slipped between the rocks, pressing himself deep into the narrow space. His shoulders scraped stone on both sides. The backpack made it tight, but he managed. Footsteps pounded past, men arguing. He went this way. No, toward the ridge. Split up, he can't have gone far. The flashlight beam swept over the Manzanita but didn't penetrate. George held his breath, making himself small, making himself stone. After several minutes, the sounds faded. George waited another 20 minutes in the cramped space before he risked stepping out. His legs cramped. His body ached. But he was alive. He squeezed through the gap and started the walk home. He wanted to return to the creek to fill the rest of his bottles. But the risk was too great. They could be there, waiting for him. Better to head home and take a long, winding route than risk another encounter. Next time, it might not turn out so well for him. George was careful, moving through backyards and alleys, checking for watchers. His house looked abandoned because they'd worked hard to make it look that way. Weeds choked what had once been a showcase garden in the overgrown neighbor's yard. The neighbor left in month 3 after looters broke in and murdered his wife while he was out looking for supplies. George watched from the basement window, did not intervene, and rationalized that it was not his issue. Lone wolves survived. Nosy people did not. He slipped through the hidden gate he had installed and stepped into his own backyard, eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. The dead landscaping told a story of abandonment. Shirley's beloved roses were left without water, and withered stalks overtook her vegetable patch. From the outside, the house screamed, "Already looted, nothing left, move along." George took down the curtains, leaving the picture window bare. Anyone could walk up and see inside. That was the intention. The front room was empty except for a loose, hanging light fixture. He scattered trash to add to the effect. Everyone knew looters always took the good stuff, so why bother with a place that looked picked over? Somehow, the ruse had worked. Up to this point, no one had bothered them. No one broke in or even knocked on the door. The back door opened silently. George had oiled every hinge in the house, learned where to step and where not to step. Noise discipline. Another lesson from the survivalist podcasts he'd consumed obsessively before the world validated all his fears. He crept down the basement stairs. Their basement had become their entire world. During the day, they slept in shifts, taking turns watching and listening. At night, when most people bedded down, George left for supplies while Shirley maintained their refuge. She looked up from the recliner by the battery-powered lantern. Even in the faint light, George could see the hope in her expression, a hope that died when she met his eyes. What happened? George unslung the backpack and set it on the kitchen table. He pulled out the 2 bottles, one full, one half full. "You're safe?" Shirley asked. "I'm here." He shrugged. "I made sure no one followed me. I didn't want to risk going back to the creek and didn't think it was a good idea to try any salvaging tonight. Probably smart." Her shoulders sagged. She glanced toward the wall where a metal shelving unit stood. Shelves that had once groaned under a year's worth of freeze-dried meals, canned goods, rice, beans, and pasta now were essentially bare. They had made a careful inventory only yesterday. 2 weeks of food remained, perhaps 3 if they stretched it. The supply, meant to last a year, was going to run out early, either because they'd eaten more than George had calculated, because the calculations were wrong, or for some other reason. That was even with the extra items he had found while salvaging each night. The other side of the space held their queen-size bed, brought down from upstairs, piled high with bedding. The heating system had stopped working with the EMP. At least the basement held a relatively steady temperature year-round. Even so, at this elevation during the winter, it was often chilly. They wore layers and made do. Soon spring would be here and it'd warm up. Then summer and they'd wish for air conditioning even in the basement. "We're still okay," George said, nodding toward the water jugs. "With what we already had, we could go a few days if we're careful." Shirley absorbed this information with the blank expression she'd perfected since the EMP. This harder version had replaced the woman who used to laugh at his prepper obsession, who decorated their house with local art, and filled their social calendar with gallery openings and wine tastings. Thinner, quieter, guilt-ridden. "We can't keep doing this," she said. "We've made it this long. The president's broadcast said things are stabilizing." "George," her voice carried a warning. "Stop." He wanted to argue, wanted to provide evidence that civilization was clawing its way back from the brink. After the EMP, the NOAA alert radio stopped working, yet they still made a point of checking it twice daily, just in case. Early in the morning before they went to bed for the day, and again at night before he headed out. For months it had been silent, but in the middle of February that changed when the President of the United States of America made an address, the first since the EMP. The radio broadcasts aired regularly now. It wasn't usually the President, though he spoke occasionally. Most updates came from local governments and organizations. The announcements were full of hope and promises. George wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. Because they were running out of food, and if this didn't end soon, he wasn't sure what they would do. Shirley stopped believing months ago. "We should have gone to her," she said, "when it started." George closed his eyes as he shook his head. Always the same argument. "You know we couldn't," he said, keeping his tone even. Roads were chaos. No fuel. We'd be dead on some highway between here and Wyoming. We should have tried to reach Lucy. To reach our daughter, our only child, George. Lines were down everywhere. We called a dozen times that first week. Before, Shirley's voice cracked. We should have tried before the world ended. There it was. The real argument. Not about water or food or survival, about their daughter whom they had pushed away and now couldn't reach when it mattered. George slumped into his recliner. The basement pressed in, months of stale air and the same arguments looping over and over. "Janet sent me a message," Shirley continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Days before the planes crashed and everything started. She said Lucy was struggling, lost her job, started drinking too much, and was living in some terrible apartment in Prospect." George's jaw tightened. He'd heard it all before, but it still irritated him. Janet Cruz had been Shirley's best friend back in Prospect. When Lucy was young, Janet had been like an aunt to her and treated her well. But by the time Lucy became a teenager, or as Janet called her, a mouthy teen, the relationship had soured and eventually failed. Janet had plenty of criticism for their daughter, and had spent years feeding Shirley poison disguised as concern. George knew the main reason they had gone hard on Lucy after she returned from college with failing grades and a mountain of debt was Janet. Tough love, Janet had called it. She said they had spoiled her, and now look at what they had. A lazy, useless young adult. Truth be told, George had taken the job in Arizona mainly to get away from Janet. He had wanted Lucy to go with them, but Shirley did not want to appear weak in her best friend's eyes. Janet always lied about Lucy, George said. She exaggerated some, making things sound worse than they were. Shirley's hands twisted in her lap, a nervous habit she'd developed. What if Lucy really needed us and we just told her to stand on her own? George didn't have an answer. The memory of that last conversation with Lucy, which Shirley had egged him into and Janet had egged Shirley on, played in his mind on an endless loop, especially at night when sleep wouldn't come and all he had were his failures. "You're an adult now, Lucy. Time to act like one." "I made a mistake, Dad. I need help." "We're not enabling your bad choices. When you learn to be responsible, we'll talk." She had stopped calling after that. Shirley had congratulated him on practicing tough love and teaching their daughter a lesson about consequences and responsibility. Though she said the words, she still checked the phone for messages. Now, sitting in a basement with dwindling supplies and no way to contact the daughter he loved, who he worried about constantly, George understood that he'd been practicing something else entirely: pride, stubbornness. The arrogant certainty that he knew better than everyone else how the world worked. "We tried to call her when the attack started," George said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "And look at us now." Shirley looked at him with eyes that had aged a decade in 10 months. "Now we can't even take care of ourselves." George surveyed their basement and the emergency supplies he had spent thousands on, convinced he was being smart and prepared. A coworker in Wyoming had introduced him to the Prepper community podcasts about economic collapse, YouTube videos on food storage, forums where people discussed the fall of civilization as if it were inevitable. He had especially loved the podcasts about surviving on your own, never depending on anyone, living as a lone wolf. Moving to Arizona, where he knew no one, gave George free time outside work to dive into preparedness and survivalism. Shirley thought he was crazy, but she went along not because she believed, but because she was drowning in guilt over Lucy, and Janet kept feeding her stories about their daughter's failures. Enabling George's obsession was easier than facing the real problem. Now they were paying for all of it. The tough love, the isolation, the certainty that they knew better than everyone else. "I'll go out again tomorrow night," George said. "Different location, the creek further north. I won't get caught." "And if you do?" They both knew the answer. "I won't," George said. Shirley turned the lantern down, hoping to conserve batteries they couldn't replace. In the near darkness, George could barely see her face. 2 weeks of food, she said. Probably less. What happens when it runs out? George thought about the UFO community, the campfires, the laughter, how even the gangs left them alone. The way they seemed to thrive while he and Shirley slowly starved in their basement. But trusting strangers was suicide. The podcast had been clear on that. Communities turned on each other, people betrayed, resources got stolen. Better to go it alone. "We'll figure something out," George said. The next night, George prepared for his water run with the same ritual he'd developed over 10 months. Check the backpack. Confirm that the bottles were inside. Put on dark clothing. Wait for complete darkness. Shirley watched him from her recliner. "Be careful," she said. There was something in her voice George couldn't place. Not forgiveness, not blame. Maybe it was a bone-deep weariness from watching their careful plans fall apart day by day. "Always am," George said. He almost said more. Almost told her he was sorry for everything, for Lucy, for the isolation, for bringing them to Arizona in the first place. Almost told her he still loved her and always would. But the words felt too big for the darkness of the basement, too heavy for the moment before he stepped into danger. He nodded and headed up the stairs. George moved through the streets with practiced caution. He knew which houses the various groups that had formed occupied, which they had abandoned, and which they controlled. The few survivors had reorganized into territories in the old tourist town. The UFO people held the old resort area to the north, others were in the south. One of the rougher gangs had taken over the east side. George and Shirley held a single basement, population 2. Tonight he moved toward a different area of Oak Creek, one farther from where they had spotted him. The route took him through neighborhoods he'd once serviced. He passed the Martinez house he'd installed their AC unit 3 years ago, the husband complaining about the cost while his wife insisted on the most expensive model. Both dead now, killed in the first wave of violence when the grocery stores ran out of food. He'd scoured their house after their deaths, searching for anything that could help him and Shirley. By the time he got there, scavengers had already picked it over. He passed the Morrison Mansion, a 6,000-square-foot monument to excess, perched on a red rock outcropping. George had maintained their climate control systems, listening to Mrs. Morrison brag about their wine cellar and art collection. The house had burned in month 2, the family still inside. Whether accident or arson, George didn't know. The area's wealthy had fled early or died quickly. Their luxury homes sat empty now, slowly being stripped by scavengers looking for anything useful. The new water spot was better than the first, more isolated. George filled all 5 bottles this time, working methodically, screwing each cap tight before sliding it into the backpack. When the last bottle was full, George allowed himself a moment of relief. 2 days of water, 3 if they rationed. Probably not time enough for the president's promises to come true, for power to return, for the world to remember how to be normal, but enough for now. He should go scavenging and see what he could find. But he wanted to go home, carry his hard-won water, and be with his wife. The orange glow caught his eye 2 blocks from home. George's first thought was someone's campfire. His second thought was that it was too big for a campfire, too bright. The scent of smoke came next, and a wave of dread swept over him. George ran. The backpack bounced against his hips and back, water sloshing. He rounded the corner onto their street, and his worst fear materialized in front of him. Their house was burning. Flames shot from the roof, painting the night sky orange. "Shirley!" The roar of flames swallowed George's voice. He dropped the backpack in the street and sprinted for the back door. Even at a distance, the heat was intense. Smoke poured from the eaves like a living thing, thick and black and toxic. The back door was hot to the touch. George kicked it anyway, putting all his weight behind the blow. The door held. He kicked again. The wood splintered. Third kick, and it crashed inward. Smoke poured out. George dropped to his hands and knees, pressed his shirt to his mouth, and crawled into the unbearable heat. Shirley, coughing, coming from the direction of the basement door. He crawled toward the sound, smoke thickening around him, choking and stinging his eyes. His lungs screamed, his chest burned, but he forced himself forward. At the basement door, Shirley struggled upright, a backpack over one arm and something heavy dragging behind her. "Leave it," George grabbed her arm. "We have to get out." She resisted for half a second, then the house groaned around them and survival instinct took over. George pulled her away from the stairs toward the back door. They scrambled on hands and knees, both coughing, both blinded by smoke. Behind them, something crashed. George didn't look back. He pulled Shirley forward toward fresh air, toward life. They tumbled out the back door and into the yard, hitting the grass hard. George's lungs spasmed, trying to expel the smoke. Shirley coughed beside him, each hack sounding like it might tear her apart. The roof collapsed inward with a sound like the world ending, sending a column of sparks into the night sky. George and Shirley lay in the grass, coughing, covered in soot, alive for now. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, 10 months of hiding, careful discipline making themselves invisible, gone. Shirley's coughs gradually subsided, replaced by sobs. "I knocked over the camp stove," she said between gasps. "I was cooking, trying to make the rice last longer, stretching it with water, and I knocked it over. I tried to put it out, but the fire spread so fast up the curtains and I couldn't. I tried." "It's okay," George said, touching her back. "It's not okay," Shirley's voice broke. "I destroyed our home. I lost our daughter. Everything I do seems to be wrong. Everything I touch turns to—" "Stop!" George pulled her into his arms, holding her while she sobbed. 10 months of isolation and fear and guilt pouring out of her in the shadow of their burning house. Voices interrupted, people approaching from multiple directions. The fire was a beacon in the dark, visible for miles, drawing the curious and the opportunistic like moths to a flame. They had less than 2 minutes before the looters arrived to pick through the bones of their home. "We have to go," George said. Shirley nodded, still clutching the backpack she'd saved. George didn't ask what was in it. Didn't matter. Everything else was gone, their careful stockpile, their water supplies, their shelter, their illusion of safety. They fled into the darkness beyond their burning house. Behind them, voices rose. People argued over who saw the fire first and who had claimed to whatever they could salvage. 2 blocks away, hidden in the shadow of an abandoned strip mall, they stopped to catch their breath. Shirley slumped against the wall, coughing now and then, eyes still wet. Her face was black with soot except where tears had streaked it. Her clothes reeked of smoke. The backpack rested at her feet. "What do we do?" she asked. Her voice was small and defeated. George looked around the parking lot. Abandoned cars sat on flat tires. Broken glass glittered in the moonlight. Graffiti covered the strip mall's walls, territorial markings from groups claiming their piece of the collapse. This was his fault. All of it. He'd insisted on lone wolfing it, on hiding, on trusting no one. And now they had nothing. Except they did have one option, one chance. And that was a long shot. George knew where the UFO community was. He'd watched them for months while gathering water and scavenging for supplies, staying hidden in the shadows, observing their campfires and organization. New Age tourists and spiritual seekers when the collapse hit. They'd pooled resources, shared knowledge, and created something that looked almost like civilization. George had avoided them, told himself they were crazy hippies who'd get themselves killed with all that trust and sharing and community nonsense. Better to go it alone. Better to be independent. Better to be strong. But now George realized those crazy hippies might be onto something. Besides, what choice did they have? George and Shirley had one backpack between them, whatever Shirley had believed important enough to save. Without shelter, without more supplies, they wouldn't last a week. Lone wolves didn't survive. George finally understood that. 10 months too late, but he understood. "I know a place," George said. Shirley looked at him. Even in the darkness, even with her face covered in soot, he could read the question in her eyes, the hope she didn't dare voice. The UFO people? Yeah. Will they help us? George thought about what he'd seen and heard while watching them from hiding. Their laughter. The way they organized work parties and shared meals and made decisions together. Everything the Survivalist podcast said would fail, everything George had been so certain would end in betrayal and violence. I don't know, he admitted, but we're out of options. They started walking, north through the darkened streets, through the ruins of tourist paradise, toward the old resort area where the community had established itself. The walk took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of stumbling through darkness, of jumping at every sound, of wondering if they were making a terrible mistake. Shirley's hand found his, the most intimate contact they'd had in months. Years, maybe. It was strange, electric, and quiet. Two people who had barely existed in the same room suddenly touching again. The community came into view gradually, aglow in the darkness, voices carried across the night, the smell of cooking food, of wood smoke, of life. They'd made a home out of the collection of cabins and campsites and a main lodge that had catered to wealthy tourists seeking spiritual enlightenment. George did not miss the irony. The people who'd come here looking for vortexes and crystal healing and cosmic energy had figured out how to survive while everyone else died. Campfires dotted the grounds. People moved between them, carrying water, tending cooking pots, and talking. Music drifted from somewhere, someone playing a guitar. Actual music, not only survival, but culture. Humanity. The things that made life worth living beyond merely breathing. Shirley's grip on his hand tightened. Whatever happens, she said, we're together. George squeezed back. He thought about all the times they should have been together for Lucy. All the times they'd chosen pride over connection. Tough love over actual love. All the years they'd convinced themselves they were teaching their daughter a lesson instead of just being cruel. I'm sorry, George said. For everything. For Lucy, for bringing us here and leaving her behind. For thinking I knew better than everyone else. Shirley's eyes glistened with fresh tears. Me too. I let Janet poison me against our own daughter. I let guilt make me crazy instead of trying to make things right. They stood there in the darkness, two broken people covered in ash, carrying everything they owned. When the power comes back, Shirley said softly, maybe we can find her, tell her we were wrong. It's possible she found a community that's like this, band together with others in Prospect. She might be okay. I hope she did. I hope she found some security. Shirley's voice held no conviction, only desperate hope. George took a breath. Ready? No, but let's go anyway. They walked into the firelight. This has been Broad as the Road, a Havoc in Wyoming Bonus Story by Millie Copper. Produced by CU Publishing LLC and presented by Killer Cozies. Learn more about Millie Copper's books at milliecopper.com.